Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to St Hugh's and indeed to the China Centre, which is part of St Hugh's. We're delighted to have you here for this academic lecture in our Trinity term, and I'm delighted also with the subject matter, which is one which I hope will end up with a happy ending. That somewhere therein lies the possibility that purchasing things can bring happiness. So far, despite a huge collection of leather, shoes, bags, dresses, etc., I have found that notwithstanding that great collection and the short-term euphoria brought about it, I still have the misery of finding that subsequently I can't fit into very many of these things that I purchase, and that I'm totally dissatisfied with my 55-year-old self. Anyway, but I'm sure that will all be resolved subsequently by Dr. Raymond. Collin Raymond is a Ptarmigan Career Development Fellow at this university and has been with us now almost for 3 years. And I can say without hesitation that those 3 years have been an absolute delight. He has become a very significant figure here in the college. His contribution to college life, but to debate, to academic thought and endeavour has been energetic, dynamic. And when he returns to the United States this summer, we will miss him dreadfully. So we wish him very, very well in his new career in the United States, but we do very much hope, as we'd say in Scotland, that he will haste himself back here for another life in Oxford at a later stage. He works obviously at the Department of Economics and here at St Hugh's College. He came in 2012. His research focuses on the intersection of economics and psychology. Dr. Raymond completed his undergraduate studies in mathematics and economics at Arizona State University, received an MSc in global market economics and a PhD from the University of Michigan. He's been at St Hugh's, as I mentioned, since 2012 and will take up a position as Assistant Professor of Economics at Amherst College in Massachusetts this autumn. I understand that in recent years, economists have become increasingly interested in understanding how happiness, life satisfaction and other measures of well-being relate to traditional economic concepts. These include examining when higher income leads to increased happiness, whether happiness is a reflection of material well-being, or rather changes in material well-being, and how well people predict future changes in their own happiness. In this academic lecture by Dr. Raymond, he will discuss recent research drawing on cross-country surveys, long-term tracking studies and lab experiments to shed light on these and related issues. Dr. Raymond will also draw a parallel between his work and the general election, whatever the outcome at that stage, which we now know, yes, and may actually touch on the question of purchases, bulk purchases of shoes which you do not require or vaguely need. Thank you very much. Dr. Raymond.
Well, thank all of you very much for coming here. As I've told some of my friends, I'm an academic, so I'm used to giving talks to audiences of approximately 5 people, usually 2 of whom immediately fall asleep, 2 of whom spend the entire time checking their iPhone, and usually the 5th person gets up 5 minutes in and says, "Oh, I think I'm in the wrong room," and leaves. So, luckily, Sarah's told me apparently all of the doors in the China Center lock at 7, so you're all stuck here until the end of the talk. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before I get into the details of the talk, I'd sort of just like to highlight for you the things I'd like you as an audience to sort of really take away at the end of this talk in trying to understand the relationship between emotions that psychologists traditionally have studied, like happiness, and things that economists have traditionally studied, like gross domestic product and income and wealth. And the first thing is that happiness in economics has gotten a lot of play in the press and among politicians, and there's been a lot of rhetoric on both sides sort of trying to understand these relationships. And the first thing I want you to sort of take away from this talk is that, in fact, we don't know very much. This area of research is still sort of very, very young. And, some researchers and some, politicians have sort of, a particular agenda they're trying to develop, and they believe in their research, but there's other researchers who have sort of the exactly opposite view, typically. And so the first thing to sort of understand is that a lot more research is actually needed before we can come to firm conclusions about that. This leads me to the second point I want you to take away from here, which is that, in fact, there's a lot of really good cutting-edge research being done by people trying to understand this relationship. So there's a lot of young people, a lot of people who are in sort of the midpoint of their career, who are coming up with new data sets, re-examining old data sets, and really trying to understand how does life happiness and other types of life satisfaction relate to things like income and wealth and changes in life status. And actually a lot of them are based in the UK, and so you guys here are actually sort of in some sense on the forefront of being able to understand the relationship between these types of issues. The third thing I want you to take away from is actually sort of a broader message, which is that the way we're going to solve the puzzle of how happiness relates to economics is not through relying on our intuition. It's going to be done through careful empirical research. So it's going to involve going out and using data we have, possibly collecting new data, and carefully examining it and trying to test different models of happiness. But it's going to revolve around the empirical side, not around sort of the theoretical side and our intuitions. So given those sort of, framing lessons I want you to take away with, I'd like to sort of start talking about, first of all, why do people seem to think happiness and economics is important? Well, you guys are in the audience, so you at least probably have a mild interest in this sort of a topic, so there's a selection bias there. But it's attracted a lot of attention in recent years. And this dates back a while, in fact. So, ever since the Beatles, we've known that money can't, unfortunately, buy you love. But this realization actually spurred a lot of social scientists to try to understand, in fact, how does money and other traditional economic indicators like GDP relate to things like emotion and things psychologists tend to care about, and things that we can measure very easily. We just give people surveys. And this has really, really become a large industry, especially within psychology, but now within economics. And so people have begun to develop happiness measures. So these are survey measures. We go in and ask people, how happy are you? And they give a response. And these types of survey measures have been used to actually supplement, or people have talked even about replacing traditional measures of economic well-being, so things like GDP. And this began in the early 1970s. So Bhutan was the first country in the world to actually talk about using happiness. So the Bhutanese government decided to develop a gross national happiness index. So something similar to gross domestic product, which measures sort of the total value of the output of a country. Here they're trying to measure the total amount of happiness in a country. And in fact, over the years, this has become not just sort of a discussion, but an actual realization. So now, every year, the Bhutanese government releases the gross national happiness of their country. The UK has also gotten in on this action. So I don't know if you remember, but about 5 years ago, David Cameron pledged that the United Kingdom was going to officially monitor the happiness of the residents of Britain. And in fact, they've implemented this. So in fact, if you go to the Office of National Statistics, the ONS website, and you go on there, you can find not only sort of traditional measures of economic well-being, so for example, gross domestic product, gross national product, per capita income, all of these sorts of things, but you can also find measurements of well-being, including measurements of happiness. Other countries and other political entities have also gotten in on the act recently. So Dubai, South Korea, and various cities in the United States have also tried to develop indicators of happiness within the political entity. And academics have really gotten in on this. So now most national level surveys, so in the United States there's this large yearly national survey called the General Social Survey, and there's similar things in Germany, the UK, and most other major developed countries. All of these now not only survey people about their economic well-being, so do you have a job, how much are you getting paid, these sorts of things, but they also survey them and ask them things about their subjective well-being. So how happy are you, or how satisfied are you with your life? Now, why has this become so popular? Why have politicians and journalists and many people sort of glommed onto happiness as something that we should be using to understand how well off people are? Well, many people actually think it's self-evident. Happiness is the thing that we should be trying to maximize as a society. And in fact, there's a lot of prominent philosophers, a lot of prominent psychologists, and prominent economists, including Richard Layard, who's the head of well-being studies at London School of Economics, really think that this is just a self-evident truth. A lot of people seem to agree with this viewpoint. So in a recent survey done among UK residents, 80% of respondents agreed with this statement. A government's prime objective should be achieving the greatest happiness of people, not the greatest wealth. So if you believe the response of this survey, this tells us, well, we shouldn't be caring about maximizing GDP. In fact, what we should be caring about is maximizing some measurement of people's happiness. Like I said, there's also a lot of philosophers who have gotten in on this action. So Thomas Jefferson, who's probably more popular on my side of the Atlantic than over here, said the care of human life and happiness and not their destruction is the only legitimate object of good government. So notice, in here, there's nothing about, monetary wealth or ownership of anything. It's about happiness. Now, despite sort of all this optimism towards measures of happiness, there's a lot of skeptics as well, actually. So the skeptics come, I would say, in sort of three major varieties. The first variety of the skeptics sort of says, well, all of these measures of happiness, they're usually survey measures. So you're going out and you're asking people, how happy you are. So maybe all these surveys are measuring is differences across people and how they interpret the question. So some people might answer, higher just because they interpret the question in a different way. And so in fact, all we're picking up are not actual genuine differences in happiness across people due to their circumstances, but in fact just differences interpreting questions. Now, the second type of skepticism comes from a variety of research in psychology which shows that people's responses to these types of survey measures are actually going to be extremely susceptible to framing effects. So for example, depending on how you ask the question. And also short-term experiences. So there's a very famous study from the 1970s by a professor at the University of Michigan where they administered happiness surveys and people were walking into the room. And some of the individuals participating in the survey accidentally discovered the equivalent of a 10p piece on the floor before they walked into the room. These people scored, 50% higher in terms of their happiness rating when they took this survey. And so this raises a question that if you give people 10p and then you ask them, how they're doing and they're much, much happier, is happiness really a good measure of overall well-being if it's so easily influenced by these sorts of factors? Now, the third sort of argument, which has been made by a lot of economists, is that, well, we have a lot of measurements of how people are doing. We understand choices people make. We understand what people are choosing. We can use these traditional measurements, which include GDP, to sort of figure out how well people are doing. Now, if happiness is measuring the exact same thing, well, then why do we need to go out and start collecting happiness? There's no point. But if happiness is measuring something different, well, then we need to have a serious discussion about why these measurements are different. And we can't just assume that happiness is going to be the right measure. It could be the case that GDP is actually a better measure of a country's overall well-being for a variety of reasons, including the ones I've just discussed in terms of issues with happiness surveys. And so this has really sort of prompted a large discussion within economics and within psychology trying to understand, what is happiness good for in a sense. So the first big question that we sort of have been asking amongst economists is, how does happiness relate to other measures of well-being, in particular things like GDP, things like income, things like wealth? Another thing, and this goes back to the psychology study I told you about just now, was that if happiness does relate in some consistent way to well-being, what kind of well-being? Is it overall long-term well-being that we're capturing with happiness measures, or is it something that's very, very short-term that can be, significantly influenced, like things by finding a 10p piece? Another major thing that economists and psychologists have tried to grapple with is to what extent do people adapt to their circumstances? So, for example, if you win the lottery, you might be temporarily happy, but at some point you sort of adjust to your newfound wealth, and maybe your happiness level goes back down to its original. So there's some baseline level of happiness people have, and they might go away from it for a little bit, but a lot of times they just adapt to their circumstances. Now, this can be good or bad. It can be good in circumstances when bad things happen to people. It can be bad when good things happen to people. But it poses a serious methodological issue for trying to use these measurements of happiness as a real indication of how well people are doing. Because if people gradually adjust, happiness is always going to return to some average level. And so we're never going to learn anything about how well people are doing. Now, the last question is, sort of a bigger issue question, which is that, is happiness the only thing people care about? So typically, researchers assume that happiness is some sort of reflection of how well people are doing overall in their life. But research has shown that people are willing to trade off happiness for other things. So you can imagine people deciding to work longer hours for more money, even though they know it's going to make them less happy. Because, for example, they want to put their kids through college or something like this. And so it seems to be the case that people make trade-offs involving happiness that these surveys, would pick up on, but it doesn't mean people are worse off. They're making these choices deliberately. It's not a mistake, but it's because, they value happiness, but they also value a lot of other things in life. And if that's true, that again poses an issue for using these measurements of happiness, because happiness is not going to capture everything. It's just going to capture a small subset of what people care about. And so we might want to use happiness, but we're only going to want to use it in conjunction with a lot of other measurements. So, framed by a lot of these discussions recently in economics and psychology, what do I want to talk to you guys about tonight? Well, first of all, I want to talk to you about how people measure happiness, just briefly. So what do people actually do when they go out and ask these survey questions? Then what I want to do is I want to look at aggregate variation in happiness and income. So what do I mean by aggregate variation in happiness and income? Well, we're going to look sort of across different groups of people. We're going to look at the average happiness level, the average income level, and we're going to see whether those co-vary in a systematic way. And we're going to do this with a wide variety of data. We're going to look sort of within a country across different income groups. We're going to look within a country across time, and we're going to look across countries as well, and across countries over time. So there's going to be a lot of data we can use to try to analyze this type of covariance. The second thing I want to talk about is we're going to look at individual variations. So rather than looking at group averages, we're actually going to follow individual people through their life and see how their happiness level changes as their life circumstances change. And this is going to allow us to sort of, get at a lot more fundamental questions that we can't get at with this aggregate data, including to what extent do people adapt to their circumstances, and how long does it take them to adapt if they do. The last thing I want to talk to you are some recent challenges in the empirical literature to using happiness data. So reasons that we might not really want to use happiness data at all because they might have some serious issues with them. And so I want to sort of, end on sort of, the challenges note, because I think it also provides a really nice way to sort of think about stepping stones about, where the research might go in the future. So I kind of want you to keep two themes in mind while I'm sort of going through all of these different things. First of all, is happiness an output or an input to our general well-being? And so I've touched on this before. By an output, I mean we sort of have all of the different things that happen to us in life. We sort of aggregate this and try to say, how well off am I? And then that's reflected in our happiness. So that would, in that case, happiness would be an output. But happiness might be an input. So it might be the case that as part of my general well-being, I want to be happier. But I also want other things, as I mentioned before. So I also might want more money. And so happiness might be an input. And so we're going to sort of try to understand, which of these is true, or perhaps both are. And, if both of them are true, what that means for us in terms of trying to use happiness data. The second thing is saying, well, let's just assume happiness is an output, or at least partially an output. What can we do with it? So in that case, what does it reflect? So does happiness actually reflect overall well-being? So how much money, for example, I have, or how well off am I? Or, as I said before, might it just reflect short-term changes in my life circumstances? And so sort of keep both of these sort of themes at the back of your head as I'm going through and talking about the data. So the first thing I want to talk about is, how do we measure subjective well-being? So throughout this talk, I'm going to use the term happiness, just because I think it's very easy. It's not too many syllables relative to subjective well-being. But more generally, sort of formally, we talk about subjective well-being because this encompasses ideas not just like happiness, but also things such as life satisfaction, which is highly correlated on surveys with happiness, but not exactly the same thing. So also in the back of your head, keep this in mind, is that sometimes the data I'm going to be showing you, the questions aren't always exactly how happy are you? It might be how satisfied with your life are you? So examples of the questions actually are, on the whole, how satisfied you are with the life you lead. And so then respondents will sort of answer from very to not at all satisfied. So this would usually be between a 5 and a 10-point scale, depending on the survey. A second type of question you might ask is, now taking everything about your life into account, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your life today? And then people will rank from satisfied to dissatisfied, with satisfied being 1 and dissatisfied being a 10. Another question is, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are? And then people fill in the blank. So you would say, for example, from very happy to not too happy. So notice all of these questions. What we're trying to do when we're asking these questions, we want to get people to think in a more general frame of mind. We're not trying to get people to say, how happy are you right now? Or how happy are you today? We want people to think about sort of their general life situation and respond to that. And so this is one way people who design surveys have tried to get around the issues that I mentioned before from these psych studies, where people seem to, a lot of times when they just say how happy they are, they think of sort of immediately, what's just happened to me. And so this is sort of, what we're using typically. And so you're going to see usually, I'm going to show you a bunch of figures. The vertical axis is usually going to be people's answers to this question. And so it's going to be, some type of averaged answer across one of these types of questions. The exact question is going to differ depending on the data that I'm showing you. Now, one big question is are these survey measures useful in any way? It's hard to know this for sure, but we have a lot of corroborating evidence that it's meaningful. So different survey measures. So I showed you 3 different questions here. Different questions, people tend to give very similar answers. So people's answers are correlated across different types of questions. So it seems like they're giving consistent answers at least. Moreover, if you go back to a person, say a week later, and ask them the same question, they tend to give you, unless some major life changes happen, they tend to give you a very similar answer. So this is what in psychology we call test-retest validity. It means if you ask somebody the same thing, they tend to give you the same answer. And that's usually an indication that a question is sort of asking something meaningful and getting a meaningful answer. Moreover, people's answers, so people say, they're very happy on these survey measures. Typically, they're observed smiling a lot, laughing a lot. They tend to be more sociable. And in fact, if you put them in an MRI and, scan their brain, in fact, the parts of their brain that we know are sort of associated with happiness actually light up more if they answer higher on these surveys. So we sort of have a variety of observational evidence that seems to corroborate that these survey measures are actually picking up something meaningful. Moreover, if you have this person's friends, if they rank themselves high on happiness, if you ask their friends how happy is this person, their friends will usually say that they're happy also. So there's, if you have sort of outside, in some sense, independent evaluators of somebody's happiness, it tends to be highly correlated. And so all of this leads both psychologists and economists to believe that, in fact, even though these questions are just sort of subjective and we're asking people, they tend to give real answers. These answers are meaningful and we should be able to use them in some sort of way. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be variations in aggregate income and aggregate happiness. So what do I mean by this? Well, as I said before, what we're going to look at is we're going to sort of look at averages across groups in terms of income and happiness and try to understand how they relate. I think a lot of you probably have the sense, well, the answer to this should actually be obvious. More interestingly enough, though, I think if I surveyed many of you, a lot of you would have completely opposite answers in terms of how it's in terms of how it's obvious. Now, there's sort of 2 types of people thinking this is obvious. One is sort of, what I would call sort of after, this rap song by the Notorious B.I.G. is the more money, more problems camp, which says that, in fact, if you get more income, you're not actually going to get any happier. On the other hand, I think there's sort of the Joan Rivers camp. So Joan Rivers is this very famous comedian from the United States. And Joan Rivers had this joke, which was basically, people say that, money isn't the key to happiness. But I figure if I'm rich enough, I can just have the key made. And so, she's much more in sort of the vein that, look, it's obvious that, money should be correlated with greater wealth. And in fact, as you're going to see as we look at the data, both things are sort of true. So if you look at the data, there's a bit of truth in both things. Now, the biggest sort of puzzle or paradox in happiness studies is something called the Easterlin paradox. So this dates back to the 1970s. A professor at UCLA named Richard Easterlin. And so he sort of summarized his paradox, saying, in all societies, more money for the individual typically means more individual happiness. So if you take a snapshot of a group of people at a time, people that are richer tend to be happier. However, if we look across countries or across time, if we raise everybody's income, it's not the case that everybody gets happier. And so, in fact, I'm going to show you there's very robust evidence that within countries at a particular point in time, this is true. So, richer people are happier. But much less evidence is linking aggregate income and aggregate happiness over time or across countries. So this is much, much harder to observe. And there's been a lot of disputes about this in the recent years over whether this is true or not true. So the first thing I want to show you is the relationship at a particular time between income and happiness. So the horizontal axis here is going to be average family income. So on your left-hand side, this left-hand panel is going to be sort of real income, non-normalized, and the vertical axis is happiness. It's almost the same here, but here we've taken the natural log of income to make everything look more linear. So it's just sort of a trick we use to transform the data to make everything look a little bit prettier. If you look at either picture, though, the relationship is really obvious, I would say. As people are having higher incomes, they're getting happier. And so this is for the U.S. Data, but if you look this has been done in over 100 countries. Look at any particular point in time, you see this relationship. So it's really, really robust. In contrast, what happens if we look at a country over time? So now, the horizontal axis isn't income, but it's year. And so these years are going from the 1970s to the early 2000s. The vertical axis is going to represent two things. It's going to represent both real income, and this is US data, and it's also going to represent average happiness on one of these national level surveys. Notice the dotted line, real income, is steadily rising between 1973 and 2003. So this is exactly what you would expect. The US economy is growing pretty steadily over this period in time. In contrast, if you look at the happiness data, it's basically flat. So there's no real difference between how happy people said they were in 1973 versus 2003, despite them being quite a bit richer. And so this is sort of the fundamental bit of the Easterlin paradox, is that we observe this at a particular point in time, but we observe this as we look over time. So the question becomes, how do we resolve these two pictures? So there's been a couple of ways to try to resolve this. First is the idea maybe our happiness isn't driven by sort of our absolute income, but it's our income compared to other people. So I'm happier if I'm wealthier than all my neighbors. But if I get richer and all my neighbors get richer, I don't actually get any happier. And in fact, if I get richer, but my neighbors get even richer than I, so I go down in the rankings, in fact, I'll get sadder. And so this is sort of one way of maybe answering the question, because this would explain the time data, but also the data at a particular point in time. The other way that people have tried to explain this is to say, well, maybe the relationship between happiness and income actually depends on income level. So maybe if I get richer and I'm really poor, I get happier. Because I can buy a lot more. I can take care of all my necessities and start consuming some luxuries, and that's really nice. But if I'm already rich, what am I going to do with my extra money? I'm going to go out and have a couple more beers every week or something. So there might not be any more happiness. The third option is also maybe we just have mismeasurement. Maybe there's something special about the U.S. Maybe the trends we're observing in the U.S. aren't necessarily generalizing, to a lot of countries. This has been one tack that's been pursued by a couple of famous economists, Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. And so they recently recompiled a lot of the data, and this is over a 6 to 8 year time period, and they collected it for over 100 countries. So each dot here is a country, and they collected for each country over 6 to 8 years. Now, again, on the horizontal axis, we're going to be looking at real income. So this is normalized GDP per country. On the vertical axis is, again, people's happiness. As you can see, across countries over this time period, we're observing a really, really strong correlation between more income and people getting happier. Moreover, for each dot, you're going to observe a small arrow going through it. That arrow is going to indicate how happiness changed with income within a particular country. Now, if you squint, you're going to see that basically all of these dots are pointing to the right and up. That's going to indicate that over this time period, it seems to be the case that happiness is actually positively correlated with income within a particular country over time. Now, Easterlin has had sort of, two responses to this. The first response is that, well, this is for a very short time period. So the picture I just showed you before, here, this is over 30 years. This picture is over 6 years. And so one response is, well, we're just not looking at long enough time periods. It takes a while for people to sort of happiness to readjust to their higher level of income. Now, the second response, which I think is also really important, is that this survey evidence was collected in sort of the 2000s, when a lot of countries were actually recovering from major recessions. And so you might imagine is that they had experienced a negative income shock, late 90s, early 2000s. Then when we're looking at the survey evidence, they're going through and experiencing income growth. And so they're comparing, they're comparing their current well-being to what it was during the Depression, and so you're seeing these happiness levels. And if we looked over longer time periods when countries weren't coming out of depressions, we would actually see a different data pattern. Now, the second point that I also mentioned has been found to actually have a lot more bite, which is that maybe the relationship between happiness and income varies with income level. So this is a recent paper by Proto and Risticchini, and what they do is they sort of are plotting out, again, here, this is an actual income level, but this is quartile of an income distribution overall in the world. But it's it's a similar scale. And then the vertical axis is then happiness. So it's the same as what we've looked at before. And what they find is that you have this positive relationship between income and happiness up to a certain point. Then it becomes flat and actually becomes a little bit negative. So in fact, there seems to be a satiation point in the data when you're trying to understand the relationship between income and happiness. And this satiation point is actually $3,600. So that would be something like 25,000, 28,000 pounds per year seems to be the satiation point. And so that's a relatively low point, but it's pretty robust data here when they're sort of trying to fit this curve. You can just looking at the dots, you can sort of see how it flattens and begins to decline. Now, I think this is, all this evidence is really interesting, and I think it's important. But it also poses a lot of problems for us trying to use happiness, right? Because we have a lot of this contradictory evidence. Maybe at a particular point in time, we can sort of understand how well one individual is doing relative to another by using happiness. But this might not be able to tell us a lot over time, or even at particularly high income levels. And this sort of has led to two responses by economists and psychologists. One camp sort of says, well, the way to interpret all of this is that we know that people like more money. More money is good for people. And so therefore, this indicates that happiness is probably not the right measurement to be using to supplement GDP. There's the other camp which says, well, I don't know whether more income is always better for people, but I do know that happiness is good for people. And so therefore, what this tells us is that we probably shouldn't worry about more income after a certain level. And so, in fact, at some point, we shouldn't use happiness to supplement GDP. We should probably just stop worrying about GDP growth once we hit a certain income level. And so those have been like these two contradictory responses. To actually sort of disentangle which of these two is probably the proper response, we have to go down to individual level data. We actually have to look at how do individuals react. And this is because we can actually see how individuals' happiness responds one-on-one to changes in personal income or to changes in other life circumstances. So, for example, if we see people's happiness responding in the correct way to other type of life events, so for example, marriage, having a kid, these sorts of things that we know, for example, seem to be good, people choose to do these things, they seem to be welfare improving, well, that would give us some idea, well, happiness is maybe a good measure, and maybe it's just that, people don't care about that much money once they reach a certain point. In contrast, if happiness also seems to respond in strange ways to other major life events that we know are good, well, this might also then lead us to believe that maybe happiness really isn't a good measure. And so that's what economists have turned to trying to do. So rather than looking at this aggregate data, we're doing these life tracking surveys where we survey people once every 6 months, ask them what's happened, and then ask them what their happiness levels are. So to sort of build on what we were just talking about, the first thing I want to think about is individual level changes in happiness and income. And so what this graph is going to be showing us is what happens when an individual gets a raise or is getting a shock to their income. It could also be an inheritance, something like this. What happens when they get this to their happiness? So rather than this being income now, this is going to be time.